Welcome back to Crime Time Inc.
Well, this week we have a particularly intriguing case.
Oh, yeah.
The 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders.
A case that, as you mentioned, is intriguing not only for the heinous crimes themselves, but also for the mystery surrounding them.
Because despite numerous leads and a prime suspect, the case remains unsolved to this day.
So, for our listeners who might not be familiar with this case, can you set the scene for us? What exactly happened?
Okay, imagine this. It's September 1982 in the Chicago metropolitan area. Seemingly random people start dying after taking what they believe to be a safe, common over-the-counter pain reliever, Tylenol,
And the cause of death?
potassium cyanide. Someone had laced those Tylenol capsules with the lethal dose of poison.
7 people lost their lives, right?
That's right, 7 victims in total. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman, postal worker Adam Janus, along with his brother Stanley and Stanley's wife Teresa.
Oh, wow.
We also had Mary McFarlane, Paula Prince, and Mary Reiner all falling victim to these poison capsules.
That really brings home the randomness of it all, doesn't it? A young girl, a postal worker, newlyweds, all just going about their day.
Absolutely, and that's what made this case so terrifying. It shattered the sense of security people had. This wasn't a targeted attack, it was indiscriminate, leaving everyone wondering if they could be next.
You mentioned earlier that the case remains unsolved, so no one has ever been officially charged or convicted for these murders.
Correct, although there has always been a prime suspect. No one has ever been held accountable for these deaths in a court of law.
Before we get to that prime suspect, I think it's important to understand the timeline and the immediate impact of these poisonings. This wasn't just a local Chicago story, was it? This case sent shockwaves through the entire nation.
You are absolutely right. It had an unprecedented impact on consumer safety and how we as a society perceive product tampering.
Let's delve into the details of the timeline then. When did the first death occur?
The nightmare began with the tragic death of 12-year-old Mary Kellerman on September 29, 1982. She had taken a Tylenol capsule for a cold and collapsed.
A young girl just starting her life, becoming the first victim of such a horrific act.
Yeah.
It's hard to even imagine.
On that same day, Adam Janus, also in the Chicago area, died after taking Tylenol for what he thought was a cold.
What a terrible coincidence.
Except it wasn't a coincidence. As investigators would later determine, both Mary and Adam had ingested Tylenol capsules laced with potassium cyanide, and this was only the beginning.
Didn't this case have some pretty unusual details around Adam Janus's death? Something about his family?
Yes, that's right. His family gathered at his home to mourn, and tragically, 2 other family members ended up taking Tylenol from the same bottle Adam had used.
Oh, no.
His brother Stanley died later that same day, and his new wife Teresa died 2 days later.
It's almost like the grief and loss were compounded by this invisible poison lurking in seemingly harmless medicine bottles.
That's a very apt way to put it. The fear was palpable. Imagine the ripple effect. 1 death followed by another, and then 2 more, all connected to this 1 bottle of Tylenol. People were terrified.
Can you describe the public response as the news spread? It must have been utter chaos.
It was. Picture this. The city of Chicago essentially comes to a standstill. People are being warned not to take any Tylenol. Stores are pulling products off their shelves. The police are using loudspeakers, urging residents to discard any Tylenol they have. It was a level of panic and uncertainty unlike anything most people had ever experienced.
And rightfully so. The victims were so random, it left everyone wondering, could I be next?
Exactly. The randomness of the victims. A 12-year-old girl, a postal worker, newlyweds, made it impossible to feel safe. No one knew who might be targeted next.
It's hard to imagine that fear gripping an entire city.
And that fear extended well beyond Chicago, really affecting the entire country, especially after the copycat attacks started popping up.
Copycat attacks? You mean people started imitating the Tylenol poisonings?
Unfortunately, yes. The Tylenol murders inspired a wave of copycat attacks across the nation. Products like Excedrin Sudafed, even eye drops were tampered with. It was a terrifying time with people constantly on edge, questioning the safety of everything they consumed.
Let's talk about the investigation itself. How did investigators determine that the cyanide was added after the Tylenol had left the factories? That seems crucial to understanding the scale of the crime.
That was a pivotal moment in the investigation. You see, the contaminated capsules were traced back to different lots and even different manufacturing plants. This meant the tampering didn't happen at the source, but somewhere along the distribution chain. Most likely in stores themselves.
That's a horrifying thought. It means whoever did this was out there among everyday people, deliberately planting these death traps on store shelves.
Exactly. It wasn't a case of negligence or a manufacturing error. This was a deliberate act meticulously planned and executed to cause maximum harm.
So if it wasn't a manufacturing issue, how did they determine the cyanide was introduced into the capsules?
They found that the capsules themselves weren't uniformly filled with cyanide. Instead, it was more like someone had emptied out some of the acetaminophen powder from the capsules and replaced it with potassium cyanide crystals.
Uh-huh.
It seems the perpetrator had opened the capsules, tampered with their contents, and then resealed them.
Making it look almost like a normal bottle of Tylenol.
Exactly. It was a chillingly calculated move designed to sow fear and distrust.
And this is where James Lewis enters the picture, right?
Yeah.
Our prime suspect.
Yes, James Lewis is a name that will forever be linked to the Tylenol murders. Shortly after the poisonings began, Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer of Tylenol, received a letter. This letter demanded $1 million to stop the killings.
And this letter was traced back to James Lewis.
Precisely. This, of course, immediately put him on the radar of the authorities.
What kind of person was James Lewis? What do we know about his background?
Well, even before the Tylenol murders, Lewis had a past shrouded in darkness. He had been charged with murder in a previous case.
Oh, really?
His client at the time, Raymond West, had been found dismembered.
Dismembered. This is getting more and more unsettling by the minute.
It is indeed. The details of that case were quite graphic. West's body was found in pieces, and the evidence pointed towards a brutal and calculated act.
But he wasn't convicted?
No, the case was ultimately dismissed on a technicality. However, it certainly cast a long shadow over Lewis and made him a prime suspect in the eyes of many.
So did he admit to sending the extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson?
He did. He confessed to writing the letter, but claimed it was an attempt to frame his wife's former employer. A rather elaborate scheme, wouldn't you say?
So an attempt to shift blame. But was he successful?
Not quite. He was convicted of extortion and served over 12 years in prison. Justice of a sort was served, but not for the Tylenol murders themselves.
So a convicted extortionist with a history of violence, but no charges for the murders. That must be incredibly frustrating for the victims' families.
Absolutely. Despite Lewis being considered the prime suspect and subjected to intense scrutiny and investigation, he vehemently denied any involvement in the Tylenol poisonings.
I'm sensing there's more to this story, though. There must be a reason he remained a suspect, despite his denials.
You are right. There are some rather disturbing details that make it difficult to simply dismiss James Lewis as an opportunistic extortionist exploiting a tragedy.
Okay, let's talk about those details then. What else don't we know about James Lewis?
Well, during the investigation, Lewis volunteered information to the investigators that was very unsettling. He provided chillingly accurate details about how the poisonings could have been carried out. He even described a method he referred to as the drill board method, which involved a technique for tampering with capsules without leaving any DNA evidence behind.
So he was essentially giving them a how-to guide for committing the perfect crime.
It was a bizarre turn of events. Was he genuinely trying to be helpful, or was it a twisted way of taunting them with his knowledge? It's a question that has haunted investigators for decades.
This all just adds another layer of complexity to an already baffling case. A suspect with a violent past, a clear motive, and detailed knowledge of the crime, yet never formally charged.
And it doesn't stop there. We haven't even touched on the tragic story of Lewis's daughter. Yes, Toni Ann Lewis's story adds another layer of complexity to this case. She had tragically died years earlier due to a heart defect.
How does this tie into the Tylenol case?
Well, during surgery to repair Toni Ann's heart defect, the sutures used failed. Those sutures were manufactured by a subsidiary of none other than Johnson & Johnson.
So potential motive for revenge. This is starting to feel like something out of a Greek tragedy, a man driven to commit unspeakable acts to avenge the death of his child.
It's certainly a compelling theory, but Lewis never publicly acknowledged this as a potential motive.
Still, it's a disturbing coincidence that adds weight to his potential involvement.
Indeed, and the story takes another unexpected turn in the late 2000s when the FBI, in a renewed effort to solve the case, decided to conduct a series of undercover interviews with Lewis.
Undercover interviews. That sounds intense. What were they hoping to uncover?
They wanted to see if they could catch him in a lie, to trip him up, and get him to reveal something he'd been hiding all these years. During these interviews, Lewis contradicted his earlier claims about the extortion letter, suggesting he may have actually started writing it before the public even knew about the Tylenol deaths.
So that really throws his initial explanation into question. It seems like he was planning the extortion from the very beginning, perhaps even before the poisonings took place.
It's a very troubling detail if he was indeed planning the extortion before the deaths. What does that say about his potential involvement in the poisonings themselves?
And what was the outcome of these undercover interviews? Did they lead to any concrete evidence?
Well, in 2009, following these interviews, the FBI searched Lewis's home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, seizing various items, hoping to find a piece of the puzzle that would link him definitively to the crimes.
But still no charges were filed.
No, despite what appeared to be a growing body of evidence against Lewis, no formal charges for the Tylenol murders were ever brought against him.
This is becoming more and more like one of those unsolved mysteries that you just can't shake. How is it possible that a case with a prime suspect, a potential motive and detailed knowledge of the crime, remains unsolved after all these years?
It's a question that continues to perplex investigators and the public alike. It speaks to the complexities of criminal investigations, the difficulty in proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and the limitations of even the most advanced forensic techniques.
It's also a reminder that sometimes, despite our best efforts, some mysteries may forever elude us.
Precisely. But that doesn't mean we stop searching for answers. In 2010, there was a glimmer of hope when both James Lewis and another potential suspect, a man named Roger Arnold, submitted DNA samples.
Another suspect. Tell me more about Roger Arnold.
Roger Arnold had also been on the radar of investigators and was later convicted of murder in a completely unrelated case. Unfortunately, Arnold passed away in 2008, so his DNA sample was taken posthumously.
So they had DNA samples from both Lewis and Arnold. This could be the breakthrough they needed.
Everyone was hopeful, but it was not meant to be. The DNA samples from both men were compared to the evidence collected back in 1982, but neither of them matched the DNA found on the tainted Tylenol bottles.
So back to square one. It's almost as if the perpetrator vanished into thin air, leaving only a trail of devastation and unanswered questions in their wake.
It's a truly perplexing case.
It's almost as if these murders serve as a constant reminder that the world can be a dangerous and unpredictable place.
It's a sobering thought. We want to believe we're safe in our homes, our communities, but the Tylenol murders shattered that illusion for many people. It revealed a dark undercurrent of vulnerability in everyday life.
It highlighted the fact that anyone, anywhere, can become a victim, regardless of their age, background, or social status. That's a scary thought to live with.
It is. But even though we can't eliminate risk entirely, we can be vigilant, aware of our surroundings, and look out for each other.
Speaking of looking out for each other, let's talk about the lasting impact of the Tylenol murders. I mean, you can't buy a bottle of over-the-counter medicine today without encountering those tamper-proof seals.
That's absolutely right. The Tylenol murders were a turning point for consumer protection. Before 1982, tamper-resistant packaging was virtually non-existent. It wasn't something that manufacturers or consumers really thought about.
It's remarkable how something so tragic could lead to such a fundamental shift in how we think about product safety.
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of collective action to bring about positive change. Johnson & Johnson, in the face of this unimaginable tragedy, responded swiftly and decisively.
Yeah.
They immediately pulled all Tylenol capsules from the market, offered replacements for already purchased products, and worked closely with the FDA to develop new tamper-resistant packaging.
It must have been a massive financial hit for the company.
It was, but they prioritized public safety above all else. Their actions became a textbook example of how companies should handle product safety issues.
And their efforts led to the development of the tamper-resistant packaging we see everywhere today. It's a legacy that has undoubtedly saved countless lives.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the packaging itself. The entire pharmaceutical industry shifted away from capsules as a delivery method for over-the-counter medications. Capsules, as we discussed earlier, were relatively easy to tamper with.
Right.
Someone could open them, add a contaminant, and reseal them without leaving obvious traces. Tablets, on the other hand, are much harder to alter without detection.
It's a fascinating example of how a single event can lead to such widespread change.
It also serves as a reminder that we should never become complacent. Vigilance, awareness, and reporting anything suspicious are crucial aspects of maintaining a safe environment.
It's interesting that despite all the evidence pointing toward James Lewis, the authorities never felt confident enough to charge him with the murders.
Yeah.
What do you think was the missing piece of the puzzle?
That's a question that has lingered for decades. Without being privy to all the details of the investigation, it's difficult to say for certain. However, I believe it ultimately boils down to the burden of proof. In a criminal case, you need evidence that directly links the suspect to the crime beyond a reasonable doubt.
And despite Lewis's suspicious behavior, his past, his knowledge of the poisonings, they may have lacked that irrefutable piece of physical evidence.
Precisely. A fingerprint on one of the tampered bottles, a witness placing him at the scene of the crime, something concrete that undeniably connected him to the act itself. Without that kind of proof, securing a conviction becomes incredibly challenging, especially in a high-profile case like this one.
The pressure must have been immense. The entire nation was watching, and a failed prosecution could have further eroded public trust and created the perception that the killer had gotten away with it.
Absolutely. The stakes were incredibly high, and prosecutors were understandably reluctant to bring a case to trial unless they were absolutely certain they could win. It was a balancing act between pursuing justice and ensuring that any charges brought were backed by the strongest possible evidence.
Which ultimately left them in a stalemate. They believed Lewis was responsible, but lacked the irrefutable proof needed to bring him to trial.
It's a frustrating situation knowing that someone committed these horrific crimes but may never be held accountable in a court of law.
And with Lewis's recent passing, it seems even less likely that this case will ever see a formal resolution.
It's like a story without an ending, and that's perhaps what keeps people so captivated by the Tylenol murders. The mystery lingers. The questions remain unanswered, and we're left to grapple with the unsettling notion that some acts of evil may forever elude our grasp.
It's a sobering thought and a reminder that even in our modern age of forensic science and advanced investigative techniques, some mysteries may forever remain unsolved.
And yet, despite the lack of a definitive answer, there are valuable lessons to be learned from the Tylenol murders. Lessons about vigilance, about the importance of product safety.
It's a bittersweet legacy. Lives were lost and families were forever altered. But the impact on product safety and the way companies handle crises is undeniable. It's a story that will likely be told and retold for years to come, a cautionary tale about the fragility of life and the enduring mystery of unsolved crimes.
A reminder that even in our modern age, with all our technological advancements and forensic capabilities, some questions may never have answers.
Right.
And some wounds may never fully heal.
On Sunday, we'll hear from a man who regularly has to take headache tablets after talking to Simon for an hour. Tom Wood will discuss this case with Simon in their weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.